So, hi and welcome to the show. It's got a message telling me there's a problem on Facebook, so I'm sorry. It's on YouTube and we're on LinkedIn, but apparently not currently running on Facebook. Not quite sure why that is. Just going to try to make sure that we're getting there. No, can't see what's happening with that. So I shall have to rebroadcast it there from YouTube later on if I can't get it. Welcome to the second LGBT History Month event. Here we are having we're in the second week now of LGBT History Month. I don't know whether you're doing much within your organization to try and celebrate what's going on. But this time, I thought I was just going to do one broadcast last week. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized I needed to spend a lot more time. And so, although I do a lot on LGBT history within my presentations, depending upon what clients need, there is so much more. And so this is an opportunity for me to expand on some of that. And it's been a bit of a challenge this week because I didn't realize until I started looking into it that actually I hadn't really researched that period of the 18th century particularly well. So I'm going to be looking at 18th and 19th century, and it was a really bad time if you were gay. Everything sort of went wrong, and in order to understand that, we're going to need to have a little look back. Now, what I will ask is if you come on live and if you want to come on and have a little chat at the end of the show, you're more than welcome to. Just let me know and I'll give you a link. But do ask questions, make comments. If you're watching in from LinkedIn or from YouTube, just put questions in there and I will pick those up and do my best to answer any questions that you might have. And well, let's go for that. Now, I think probably the best thing for me to do right now, I'm going to start off. LGBT History Month started in 2005. It was a response to the legislation in 2003 that repealed Section 28 of the Local Government Act. That had prevented all local authorities, schools, anybody from supporting and promoting homosexuality as normal. So schools couldn't talk about it. If kids had gay parents or lesbian parents, then they just had to try and explain that away. The teachers couldn't help explain it because it was effectively banned by that horrible piece of legislation for a very long period of time. So once that had been repealed, schools found themselves in a position they didn't really know how to now tackle the fact that they were allowed to talk about it. What were they going to say? How could they do it in a way that was actually not going to create all sorts of problems with parents? And Sue had already had a site called Schools Out, which was providing an enormous amount of support to help schools to deal with issues, started putting forward material. And let me introduce Sue. She's done a little video to introduce LGBT History Month this year, and I was watching it the other day and I thought, well, that would be really good. So it's about a 5-minute video talking about the theme for this year, which is largely about politics in art, and talking particularly about a couple of female artists. And this is a challenge in all things, isn't it? Next month is Women's History Month, so it actually applies to that as well. So many women, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, women just simply weren't really able to follow their own passions. So here's Sue talking about LGBT History Month, and in particular, some of the two artists.
Hi, my name is Sue Sanders, and I'm here at the National Gallery, which is truly exciting. And we're going to launch 2022 LGBT+ History Month. So we at Schools Out, every year, choose a theme. And this year's theme is going to be political artists. Now, we also choose 5 people to represent that theme. So that they are the L, the G, the B, and the T, and the plus, so we show the full diversity of our community. This year, we are here at the National Gallery to have a look at two artists who aren't the chosen ones, aren't one of those five, but do in fact fit beautifully with the theme. And the first one is one of my favorites. It's Rosa Bonheur. And it's an amazing picture of a horse fair. And the exciting thing is that not only is it a painting of Rosa Bonheur's, but it's also been worked on by her lover, Nathalie Mikas. I'm so excited to see this painting up close. Rosa Bonheur has always been a favorite of mine. She's big, bold, and beautiful, and so realistic. Now, Rosa was part of a family that did a lot of painting. And one of their traditions was to do workshop painting, so they would all work on each other's paintings. So it's no surprise, in a sense, that Rosa chose an artist to be her lover, and they were lovers for many, many years, and here they are working together on this amazing painting. Now, you'll see that it is incredibly fresh and amazingly exciting. And what's so incredible about Rosa Bonheur's painting is that she is passionate about showing the truth of animals and people. So the amazing thing about Rosa is she was passionate about enabling other people to be painters. And I mean, by people, of course, I mean women, because she was denied the chance of actually being trained to be an artist. She learnt from her father, who also set up a school for young women. And when he died, she took it over. So she consistently made sure that young women could learn the craft of painting. When Nathalie Mikas died, obviously Rosa was devastated, but she took up with another artist, an American, Anna E. Klumpke. And it was Klumpke who pulled together all Rosa's work on Rosa's death and made sure that we have this amazing collection of wonderful, bold, beautiful, realistic works. Rosa Bonheur was a pioneer. Not only was she someone who stayed in lesbian relationships all her life, she also cared passionately about the numerous animals that she had and supported artists and artwork. So what an incredibly important lesbian she is. Here we have the most incredibly self-possessed young woman. It's an amazing portrait, full of self-confidence, full of clarity about who she is. It's not a gaze looking out and expecting people to praise her. She knows who she is. And I think you can see that she is the antithesis to Rosa Bonheur. Where Rosa is big and bold, Gwen is quiet and small. Gwen John had relationships with both men and women. The relationships with men are documented. Her most famous one is Rodin. Now, frequently, bisexual women are seen as heterosexual because their relationships with women are either not recognized as lesbian, or, when we're looking back in the past, their lovers are not famous. We hear about the relationship she had with Miss Vaudeville and Rodin because they had a ménage à trois. And it's become very clear through the work of Susan Chitty that once Rodin began to not have relationships with Gwen, that the two women had relationships together. And when the relationship with Rodin finally finished, we see Gwen being much more confident and much clearer about who she is. And one of the exciting things about Gwen's portraits of all the women that she does is that they are exactly like that. Self-contained, clear, involved in their own things, often reading, often getting involved in their own lives. You can almost hear the inner thoughts going on. They're not looking out. They're not looking for interest from somebody else. So I want to thank the National Gallery. It has been incredible to be up close to these wonderful paintings. And they are, as I say, quite important to me as well. And also the National Portrait Gallery, who very kindly enabled us to have Gwen John here, because normally she sits in the National Portrait Gallery. So we've had two galleries in one session. We're really lucky. Stay online so you can discover who the L, the G, the B, the T, and the plus artists are that we are focusing on for LGBT History Month 22. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there we're back. And if you would like to find out a little bit more about LGBT History Month, the site, go to lgbtplushistorymonth.org.uk. Lots of materials there, lots of I mean, there are lesson plans and all sorts of resources. Not all of them just for schools. There are a lot of them which are really, really appropriate for organisations that might want to do through your ERG, your employee resource group, and use them there. Sorry, bit of a catch my throat there. So let's get into the LGBT 18th and 19th centuries. And in order to do that, I need to do a quick review and go back and have a look at the 17th century because it's what happened in the 17th century which suddenly gave rise to the awful experiences that took place, particularly for gay men in the 1700s. The 17th century had obviously been a period of really, really political turmoil. Everybody got really, really irritated and annoyed with King Charles I, who was pretty much trying to run the country without Parliament, and they weren't having that. So he got removed, and the Puritans took over. The Roundheads, Oliver Cromwell led the Puritans to run it, and for 20 years, 18 years, Britain became a republic with no monarch. When Cromwell died, his son took over, tried to run it, but he just wasn't the man that his father had been, and was unable to do that. And the pressure the Puritans had, all the theatres were scrapped, singing and dancing were banned. It was a time when people, religion took centre stage, and there was huge amount of pressure. And bearing in mind what had happened with Henry, getting rid of the Catholic Church, this was the Protestants really now trying to erase the Catholic Church from everything, changing the way the church ran so that it became much more of the Protestant religion they wanted. And not everybody was in favour of that. So eventually the Parliament decided it was time to bring back the next, the king, and King Charles II came in, and that brought in what basically everybody has now called as the Restoration. I'm going to bring up share some slides now so we can actually have a look and see a little bit about what was going on. Let's get rid of a few bits and pieces here which are going to clutter it. Oops. There we go. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So this was where we were with, whoops, where's my slides gone? There we are. So the restoration of the monarchy, the restoration, and it was a period of, laughter. If you think about it, restoration, we think about restoration comedies and the way in which, everything was sort of brought back to, the way everybody wanted it. It was much more the Cavaliers were back in charge. It was a royalist shift. When Charles II died, his son took over, James II, but he was a Catholic. And Britain had already decided they didn't want a Catholic king, and everything was going to be all right until James had a son who was also going to be taking over. And so they got rid of James and put Mary in, William and Mary, and really to bring about the whole Protestantism. But what then happened was a bit of a backlash in terms of the Puritans didn't like the way in which morals were going to the dogs, and so they decided to set up a society called the Society for the Reformation of Manners in 1690. And this was basically a society that's sole aim was to seek out immoral behavior. They didn't like debauchery, they didn't like prostitution, they definitely didn't like homosexuality, and in particular there were a couple of people who really went for this and didn't really like it, wanted to erase it and stop it from happening. And what they could do at that time was this wasn't something where you would be arrested by the police were all private, and a lot of the police actually worked for or were part of the Society for the Reformation of Manners. It was very well connected right into government. It had, basically that sort of extremist faction. In some ways, to be perfectly honest, not that different to what's happened with the equalities agenda within the UK right now, where all of a sudden we've got Liz Truss and Kimmy Badenoch, who are quite strongly anti-trans, and they've appointed people to the board of the equalities and Human Rights Commission, who are all equally anti-trans, and just do not want to review things. And so we've got a government-run group, and there's a very, very powerful lobby of other people, well, not lesbian, but radical feminists and parents of children who are trans, who want to stop treatment. So nothing like as bad as what happened back then, but we do have that. And this happens from time to time. The government swings one way, and where previously there'd been a lot of support, suddenly that support becomes opposition. Well, this is what happened here in the 18th century. The Society for Manners, started to do some pretty, underhand tricks. They basically did sermons and lectures around where they preached to everybody about the terrible crimes, and they felt that if prostitution and homosexuality and such were allowed to continue, it would bring about an end to society as we know it. It would bring down everybody with it. And this was Captain Edwards. Now, he was the first person that they really targeted. A gay man, or had a man who'd had a gay relationship with a young, I believe, a ship's cabin boy, 19 years old. But you have to wonder, don't you, why ships had cabin boys? What was their goal? What was the purpose of having a boy on the ship? And okay, there was wait on the captain and the officers on the ship. They would do basic errands, but what else were they going to do? If you start to look back, you begin to realize that there was very often a sexual content to it. This whole idea of boys, within a sexual content, the same thing. Drummer boys in the army. You've only got to look at the history of public schools and start to find that abuse of boys was happening all the time. The first person charged under the Buggery Act was, or the second person that was the headmaster at Eton Boys' School. So all the time, particularly at higher levels of society, we've had this constant unspoken but actual practice happening in the Catholic Church as well. And we keep seeing that popping up as well, where priests are abusing boys, where people in power are abusing children. And, same, we've had Jimmy Savile recently. This is something which just keeps on happening. It's all undercover. And very often with very powerful people, it's allowed to continue happening. Anyway, a jury first had decided that he wasn't guilty. The Society for Reformation of Manners decided he definitely was, and they really pushed this, and he was finally charged. Now, wasn't hung, and he did move on. Not everybody was hung for sexual for homosexuality, but what they would often do, and in the case of Edwards, he was pilloried. 3 times he had to go stand in the pillory. The pillory was regularly used. Now, you might think, standing somewhere and having rotten tomatoes and fruit thrown at you isn't a bad penalty. But some of the people throwing that stuff wasn't always soft fruit that was being thrown. It was hard stuff. People often died on the pillory. They often didn't recover because the injuries they received while they were there, resulted in them dying within the next 2 or 3 years. So it was a pretty bad penalty, and not one anybody would really want. 3 times he had to go up there. He was also fined £1,000. But this was the first time that they'd really started, and they did it by acting as agent provocateur. They trapped him into behaving in a way that meant they could then catch him. And this is the way in which the Society for Reformation worked. Because if I move on, you'll see that the next thing we start to look at is molly houses. From from the late 1600s, but definitely into the 1700s, molly houses started to appear all over London. There were quite a lot of them, and essentially they were brothels for homosexual men. They were a place where you could go and you could find a gay partner. Now, one of the dangers is that we've got a law around, the Buggery Act was there. homosexual acts, particularly the act of sodomy, was a capital offence. So in order to disguise the fact that they were with them, very often the young men, the young gay prostitutes, would dress as women so that they were not less easily spotted and noticed. But these were quite bawdy houses. This was the old gay clubs of the 17th century. And what happened was people would go to these gay clubs, the Society for Reformation of Manners. They found one or two people who they could basically prosecute. But instead of prosecuting, they offered them a deal. If they would become informants and get constables and people from the society into the molly houses so that they could observe who was doing what and take information so that they could then prosecute people for homosexuality or for sodomy, buggery, then they would let them off the charge. And there were a few people notoriously succumbed to that. Well, it was a choice. You get prosecuted, you might be executed, you might be put on the pillory, or you can basically do a bit of informing. And they would take a constable or somebody with them as their husband into the molly houses where everybody could observe who was there, who was actually engaging in lewd behavior, and then subsequently sue them. And between the late 1600s and into about 1727, when the molly houses really closed down, an enormous number of prosecutions took place. In fact, over that 30-year period, the Society for the Reformation of Manners claims that they had actually instigated almost 100,000 prosecutions. Now, this is not just for homosexuality. This would have been for prostitution, debauchery, a whole range of immoral acts. But amongst that was a significantly large number of homosexuality acts. And when we look at the records, we can find and see throughout that period a real peak in the numbers that were being hung, to the point that, it was like 50 a month at one time were actually being arrested and put into many of them being hung. The most famous of all of those in 1726 was Mother Clapp's Molly House. This was in the city of London, and it was a very well-known house. It was actually a coffee house, not a bar, but it was a place where everybody went. And Mother Clapp, Margaret Clapp, was arrested. This is an image of her in the pillory, because she was pilloried as a result of that and died fairly soon after that incident. So this was the nature of the way things happened, because everybody lived knowing that this was happening. But the interesting fact is that we know a lot about the gay culture of the early 17th or 18th century because of the Society for the Reformation of Manners. The whole growth in the gay community at that time was as a direct result, because what was happening, these reports were getting into the newspapers and on newspapers and news bulletins. People were hearing the lectures and sermons by members of the society. The whole of London was split up into sections, and they had people responsible for basically promoting what they were doing and encouraging people to support them and inform. So it became very well known. Everybody knew about this. This was a big issue. And because everybody knew about it, it meant that a lot of the men who were gay, who thought that they were on their own dealing with this, didn't know where to turn, were suddenly finding out information about molly houses and that there were other gay people around, that they weren't alone. And that built up a culture, and people started to learn different ways in which they could communicate to each other, something that seems still done today. Handkerchiefs hanging out of the pocket, all these different sorts of things that are done in order to flag up and indicate to people that they are gay. But at the same time, they had to be very careful, because the Society for Reformation of Manners was doing whatever they could to catch and honey trap gay people. So it was a bit of a cat and mouse game, but we know so much about what happened because of what was going on, because of the publicity that came about. But it was a pretty hairy time, let's face it. The last hanging that took place because somebody was gay was actually in 1836. The Buggery Act, which existed all the way through, was finally repealed by the Offences Against the Person Act in 1828, but it still kept buggery as a capital offence. What it introduced were a number of other things like rape and particularly sexual acts with any child under the age of 10. All of those were suddenly brought into this act, which covered a lot more. It covered physical violence against people. The last hanging was 1836. There were gay men after that who were condemned to death, actually received the death sentence, but they were never implemented. And in 1861, finally, the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 didn't repeal homosexuality, didn't decriminalize it, but what it did do was to remove the offence, the capital offence, and turn it into life imprisonment. And a couple of years later, it was then changed to basically 2 years. That was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, the Labouchet Amendment. Now, that made sexual activity between men illegal. So now we'd gone from the Buggery Act, which was purely about penetrative anal sex, whether with man, beast, woman, with anyone. Now it was focusing a lot more on any level of sexual activity. So two men just kissing would have been enough to say that's gross indecency. So suddenly everything is now, by 1885, really, really focused. And I'm going to come back to that because that's towards the end of the 19th century. Throughout the period, we've still got an awful lot that's been going on. There were peaks and troughs in the amount of pressure, but what we see through this whole period is this slightly puritanical streak going through. The last two men hung were James Pratt and John Smith. I looked at the details on it. It looks to me as if once again they had been set up. They'd been encouraged to go to someone's house. The person whose house they went to was never charged, they were caught in his boarding house and were hung. Very difficult once they were caught to get out of this. So let's have a look at the next bit. So let's have a look now at an interesting personality, the Chevalier Dion de Beaumont. In France. He was from an aristocratic family and became noticed by the King of France, and he cross-dressed. We think he was probably intersex. Not absolutely clear because of what happened, and I'll explain in a second. But because he passed so well and looked so good as a woman, the king decided it would be a really good idea to send him to Russia as part of the French ambassadors to spy on the Russians, which is what he did. For a couple of years, he was in Russia spying on what was happening and feeding information back to the French, who were having a little bit of a challenge with the Russians. And after that was over, he then came to London, where he did a similar job. Later in his life, by around about around about the time of the French Revolution, he seemed to fall foul of the French authorities, and he ended up in court with a challenge to see was he actually really a woman or was he a man? And the court decided and determined that he was really a woman, and therefore she would have to now continue to live as a woman. Was put like an injunction on her to never wear male clothes, which she didn't like to do from time to time. The Chevalier was a great swordsman, and often would undertake sword fencing competitions against men, to the great joy of the crowd when she could beat them easily. But yeah, in order to get the pension that she was being paid by the French government, she had to dress all the time as a woman. And on a few occasions, apparently had turned up at the French court dressed as a man and was promptly returned and redressed in female clothes. And the quote I read was, with corsets tied so tightly that she couldn't remove them without assistance. On her death, they decided to do an autopsy and, well, actually discovered that she was male. So that indicates the possibility that Chevalier was actually intersex, may have had, partly male bodies, may have grown breasts. That's a common thing about with some intersex conditions where, men that grow breasts. And we know that this has happened. Even, I remember last week I talked about the Hermaphrodites, the Greek goddess that was, had female breasts and male phallus. So that was the story. Now, the interesting thing about this particular picture, if you look at the one on the right, you'll see she's wearing the regalia, the Masonic regalia. And that picture actually came from the Freemason site. Now, as it happens, I'm a Freemason. I was master of a lodge. I haven't been back since I changed gender, although recently, a couple of years ago, the Masonic the lodge in England has decided that anyone who changes gender from male to female will still remain a Freemason and would still be welcome back at Masonic meetings. So I haven't actually taken up on that, but it's interesting to see that the Chevalier was a Freemason, although after the court case, when it was determined that she was female, she never returned to a Masonic lodge after that. He never returned to a Masonic lodge after that. So there we are. That's the Chevalier. Now, the other thing about the Chevalier is that in the 20th century, which I'm going to get to next week, an organisation was set up to support trans people throughout the UK, particularly people who cross-dressed, people who didn't transition permanently, but try to live that difficult life between being both male and female. And that society was called the Beaumont Society. It still exists today, still supports trans people throughout the whole of the UK, has played a huge role in supporting and helping people who had nowhere else to go. And they named it after the term Beaumont. The other interesting thing is that the word transgender, or originally transvestite, which was coined by Maxwell, his name's gone completely, coined in the early 20th century, was originally, Havelock Ellis and other psychiatrists wanted to use the term eon. We've got sadism, we have masochism, which are based upon European noblemen, and he wanted to use the term eon for eonism. The term transvestite actually was the one that remained and continued to be used to this day. Well, transgender now. All right. It's not all about men cross-dressing. Dr. James Barry was Surgeon General. He was a surgeon working during the time of the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale met him, didn't like him very much, apparently, described him as an odious little man, but there we go, that's the difference. But James Barry had risen up the ranks to become one of the most preeminent medical practitioners in the UK. And it wasn't until he died, he made it very specifically in his will, he'd said, when he dies, he is to be buried in the clothes he dies in. To remove his clothes, he would just be buried. But a nurse felt that this was utterly and completely wrong. So she decided to remove his clothes and cleanse the body in the way that they would normally prepare it for burial. And of course, that was then discovered that Dr. James Barry was in fact female. Now, interesting question here. Was James Barry a woman who wanted to be a doctor, but because that was unavailable, found that they had to impersonate a man in order to become a doctor? Or was this somebody who was actually a trans man, somebody who felt they should have been born male, wanted to be male, and proceeded in life as a male? We've interestingly seen quite a number of people, and we're going to be talking about some of these next week, women who've lived as men and then have pursued a career which probably wouldn't have been open to them had they been women, which then all immediately opens up the question. But Barry did not want anyone to know that he was anything other than the man he appeared to be. So I suspect that this was probably one of the first people that we know to be a trans man, although there are obviously, we've got lots of records going back, and I will in the future have a little look at other cultural issues. I was going to do some of this within this program, but there's so much to cover that I've decided to make that a separate issue. So there we go. Dr. James Barry, female who actually lived their whole life as a man and rose to great heights as a surgeon. So how did the shift take place within theatre? When we look at Shakespearean theatre, we know that women were not allowed to act throughout the whole of that period. As with the Shakespearean, theatre was just such a big thing during Elizabethan times, and all the female roles were played by young boys. Or older men played the sort of comic female roles, sort of the early drag queens, the early pantomime dame type characters. But most of the other younger characters, if you think of Ophelia in Hamlet, or Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, they would have been played by young men. And Romeo and Juliet particularly, this is a young woman in love with a young man. So that the character, the actor playing that, would have had to have been able to really convincingly show the audience that romantic side of that relationship. Now, when we moved into the period of the English Civil War, theatres were shut. By the time we came out of that, the taste for Shakespeare really gone. And by the time we got to the middle of the 18th century, there was even licensing, which meant that every single play had to be approved by the Lord Chancellor before it could be put on, because the king didn't like, and the government didn't like, the way in which theatre was being used to criticize the crown, to criticize the government, to criticize officials. So everything had to be checked and approved to make sure that it didn't breach those rules. And what happened was we moved into this period where musical theatre started, and very comic theatre. And vaudeville obviously was later, towards the end of the 19th century. These are some of the early drag queens. But thinking about the Molly houses, what we've had there is we've had within the gay community this culture emerging where men realize that in order to safely be seen with another man, it was better for one of them to dress as a woman. And so what happened throughout the whole of the 18th century is within the Molly houses, we've started to see more and more men dressing as women. We've seen that already in the early theatre. So, and there's a lot of commentary that I've read recently where in the 18th century, particularly within the Society for Reformation of Manners, they saw theatre as a hotbed for immorality, as a hotbed for homosexuality. Charles II had opened theatre up and said, no, women can now play parts in theatre, because they decided it was better to allow women to play those parts than to allow men to play the parts of women, and therefore engage in what they would see as sexual activity with other men as an audience. And yet all the time we start seeing that what happened is men dressing as women suddenly became the center of attainment. a center of entertainment. Very, very highly paid entertainers. But Savoy, late 19th century, so late 18th century was, 19th century, so yeah, 18, late 1800s, was one of the top drag queens in America. I'm not sure who the others are. I've been looking around for images. There's lots of pictures of men performing as women, but sometimes we don't know who they were. They were just actors on the stage. Female impersonators, slightly different, but people would go to see Julian Eltinge. This is Julian Eltinge as a man, and this was the transformation that people wanted to go and paid. Julian Eltinge was the highest paid performer of all on the stage for a while, because Julian could transform into this beautiful woman. He would finish his show by removing his wig to demonstrate that it actually was a man performing as a woman. And in Victorian society particularly, this was just, how on earth could a man do that? There was a belief that the difference between men and women was so great, it was a chasm that could never be crossed. And here was somebody magically crossing that chasm. And of course, it wasn't just female impersonators. We also had in Vaudeville Music Halls drag kings as well, an increasing number, particularly Vesta Tilley, one of the highest paid female performers, who performed. And the thing about drag is it's often parodying the other gender. So women performing as men would parody particularly the rich aristocratic men. Men performing as women would parody women, and play over the top makeup. Everything done to get laughs, to get entertainment, to get fun. Just one of the boys from Ella Wisner. So what we've seen is theatre steadily beginning to start using this, and that then brings us to pantomime. This is some early images and pictures. The Drury Lane Theatre was one of the first of theatres that was allowed to reopen once theatres had been reopened by Charles II. And pantomime was one of the major elements, particularly around the Christmas time. This image on the left there is of Robinson Crusoe, which, as it happens, back in the day in an amateur dramatics group, I was in Robinson Crusoe. I'm not entirely sure how. I think I was just, before I changed gender, I played the captain of the ship. So I was one of the characters who was, I think I was the straight character against which people were supposed to get laughs. But there's an interesting thing about pantomime that I want to explore, and it's this. Initially, pantomime started right back in the 1700s, coming out of the Italian and French theatres with Harlequin. And because, particularly during the 1700s, there was drama could only be performed in special theatres where they had a license to do it. Many theatres were only allowed to perform basically mime, musicals, and therefore we had this growth in mime, this growth in mute acting and performance, and pantomime became part of that. So it was all non-spoken theatre. As things developed, we started to move into this now. These are the primary characters in a pantomime. The principal boy, almost always played by a girl. The pantomime dame, usually the principal boy's mother. The principal boy being the hero, pantomime dame, the mother. And we see this with, Aladdin is almost always played by a girl. Aladdin's mother, Widow Twankey, is played by a boy. And then there's the principal girl who falls in love with the principal boy. So what we've got on the stage being played out for family entertainment is a man dressed as a woman. So we've got transvestism is a big part of it. Often gay characters playing those. We've got a drag king in the sense of a principal boy, usually a younger girl, who then is going to have a love relationship or romantic relationship with the principal girl. So we've got, well, basically lesbianism being played out on the stage. So it's, can you see, this is the real irony of the way in which the theatre works. So all the way through this whole period of history, on the theatre, we have played out all of the things that in private breaches all the moral idea views, but on the stage seems to be allowed. And we've got the comic lead, good fairy, and the villain always, there's always got to be somebody who's behind you. Someone's behind you. So these are some principal boys, and you can see this goes back quite a long way. This is 18th, 19th century principal boys with typical costumes. And here's some of our typical pantomime characters, Widow Twankey and Mother Goose. Well, the Mother Goose, I think, was back right from the 1700s. So let's just come to one of the last things here before we're coming towards the end today. Gross indecency. Mentioned it earlier on. This was the amendment in 1885, which added into the sexual offences any activity between men which was perceived or seen to be immoral. Any act. And it's very difficult. And very soon after the passing of that act, one of the first people to be charged under this act was Oscar Wilde. Now, there were 3 trials with Oscar Wilde. The first one, Oscar had a relationship with a young man who was the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. Queensberry was particularly obnoxious about this, really didn't like it, constantly challenging Oscar Wilde, till eventually Oscar Wilde decided to sue him for libel. During that trial, he was tricked by the prosecution counsel into making some. I mean, he was very witty, and he made the whole thing into a big theatrical show. But he managed to say something which indicated that he was gay, and as a consequence, he was then taken to court under the new gross indecency legislation. The first trial, the jury couldn't decide. He was retried. On the second trial, he was found guilty and ended up spending 2 years hard labor, most of it in Reading jail. At the end of that, he left and went to France, where he spent the rest of his life. But the impact of being in prison had been pretty terrible, and his life was not much longer, which is a great shame because huge, incredible talent. But he was the first person to be charged under the Gross Indecency Act. Now, as we'll see, I'm going to come back next week to look at 20th century. Gross indecency became the primary challenge. And even though we decriminalized homosexuality in 1967, gross indecency remained a crime right up until 2003. And so many people were charged and sent to prison under the gross indecency, because it didn't need to have been an act, any kind of act. You didn't have to have engaged in any particular sexual activity. It just had to look as if you were doing something with a man which would have led to or might have been the result of some sexual activity. So if you want to, I would strongly recommend, if you're in your organization, go to the website for the LGBT History Month plus LGBT plus History Month.org.uk. You can get this poster. It's quite a nice big poster. It runs from 1871 with a whole bunch of different people, and you can see that it is quite a big poster. I really like it. It's the kind of thing which you can put up in your office if you've got people coming back to the office now, which gives them a little bit of a flavour of people who've been involved in more recent history. I'm going to be going into 20th century LGBT history next week, and then the final one we're going to pick up and look at 21st century, the last 20 years, because that probably has been an enormous period of change and transformation in attitudes that have taken place. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting and useful. March the 31st, you might want to make a note of. Currently LGBT History Month, good time to run meetings and such like. March the 31st, I've already got one booking. For somebody who would like me to talk to their staff on the 31st of March, International Transgender Day of Visibility. If you'd like me to do a presentation, not just about LGBT history, obviously, I talk about gender generally and the issues around it, trying to understand the various different aspects of gender. And mostly, my aim and my goal is to try to help you to create a more LGBT inclusive workplace. So anyway, there's that. If you want to get hold of me, my final thing, treat everyone with dignity and respect. And if we're not got any questions here, which I don't see any, let's just take that off and bring me back. So there we are. I hope you found that a useful run through some of what happened in the 200 years from 1700 through to 1900. We're going to be looking at 20th century next year. And if you need to contact me, you can find me on LinkedIn, just LinkedIn/in Ricky Arundel. You can search for me anyway. There is only one Ricky Arundel, I've discovered. Nobody else has my name, so that's it. If you'd like to talk to me about the possibility of me organizing and running or delivering a presentation to your staff, generally on LGBT awareness, raising awareness, helping to make your workplace a more LGBT inclusive environment, calendly.com, Ricky Arundel, speaking-discovery-call. That's the address. You can get me there, or you can simply write to me at ricky@rickyarundel.com. I hope you found that particularly useful. I've enjoyed researching and putting us together. I've got quite a lot of workshops and presentations and keynotes going on during February, but there's still a bit of space left. If you'd like to book me to do a talk, contact me, and I will look forward to doing something with you. So where am I now? Right. So that's it. Thank you for being with me. Hope you've enjoyed that. And I look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday, on, what's the date today? So it's Wednesday 16th, isn't it, I think, at 3 p.m. I shall be posting that shortly on LinkedIn and everywhere else. And I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.